The night was cold and eerily calm over the North Sea. May 9, 1940. Waves rolled against the steel hull of the British minesweeper HMS Speedwell, each surge sending shudders through the thin plates of her bow. Inside the bridge, the red glow of instrument lamps cast ghostly shadows across weary faces. Among them stood Petty Officer James Hargreaves, a 28-year-old sailor from Portsmouth, his gloved hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles whitened beneath the leather. The radio hissed with fragments of coded chatter, the air dense with the scent of diesel and fear. Royal Navy log, May 1940. Hargreaves had volunteered for what many in the fleet quietly called a suicide patrol, the mission to chart and clear a newly discovered German minefield that blocked the critical approach to the Norwegian coast. Somewhere beneath the rolling waves lay hundreds of unseen killers, magnetic and acoustic mines deployed by Luftwaffe aircraft and U-boats. A single misstep, a careless turn of the rudder, and the Speedwell would vanish in a column of water and flame. Admiralty Dispatch, May 1940. By dawn, a grey mist rolled in from the east, smothering the horizon. The minefield stretched across their path like a ghost army, silent but deadly. The crew moved with the precision of ritual, lowering the paravanes. Torpedo-shaped steel floats dragged from the ship's sides, designed to cut mine cables before they reached the hull. Sparks flashed as the metal wire strained under the sea's pull. Each minute felt like an hour. The ship's engines throbbed in slow rhythm, barely above idle. Any vibration, any wrong frequency could trigger the magnetic sensors of the German devices lurking below. Naval Ordnance Report 1940. At 6:30 hours, a distant boom rolled across the water. One of their sister ships, HMS Squirrel, had struck a mine just a few miles north. The explosion's shockwave reached them seconds later, rattling the bulkheads and sending coffee cups clattering to the deck. No survivors. The Speedwell crew stood frozen, the reality settling in. They were next in line. Still, the order came through the static. Continue sweep. Royal Navy Signals Intercept, 1940. The German Navy had seeded this stretch with a new generation of weapons. Unlike older contact mines tethered to the seabed, these were magnetic, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel when they sensed the distortion of Earth's magnetic field. The British Admiralty barely understood the mechanism. Invisible death, the sailors called it. Hargreaves had studied the rough sketches pinned to the briefing room wall, crude diagrams showing how each mine, no larger than a barrel, could obliterate a destroyer. Ministry of Defense Archive, 1945. Every creak of the hull, every flicker of the compass needle became an omen. They navigated blind, using a patchwork of charts and compass bearings calculated by dead reckoning. A skill Hargreaves had learned years earlier, long before radar or sonar made war at sea less uncertain. Through fog and silence, he guided the Speedwell as though tracing the invisible edge of a knife. "Keep her steady," the captain murmured. "And pray she listens." Captain's log, HMS Speedwell, 1940. Below decks, the stoker crew whispered stories about ships that had simply vanished in the same waters. The men spoke in hushed tones of a cursed channel, where even the gulls refused to fly. But superstition was all they had to balance against terror. One sailor taped his daughter's photograph above his bunk. Another recited fragments of psalms, his lips moving soundlessly. "We weren't fighting the Germans," one survivor would later say. "And we were fighting the sea itself." Oral History Project, Imperial War Museum. At midday, the fog thickened into a solid wall. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Hargreaves leaned on his charts, tracing a pencil line between two perilous coordinates, the only gap left uncharted by earlier sweeps. The captain hesitated. To turn back meant abandoning the convoy routes that kept Britain alive. To advance meant sailing straight through hell. "We go on," he ordered. Admiralty Mission Directive, 1940. The sound of the ocean changed. The rhythmic splash of waves gave way to dull, hollow thumps, the acoustic sensors of nearby mines reacting to their presence. The engineer cut the engines to half speed. The ship glided forward on momentum alone, a 500-ton steel coffin drifting through an invisible graveyard. Hargreaves could feel his heartbeat echoing in his fingertips. Every instinct screamed to stop. But he steered on. Then came the metallic ping. One of the paravanes struck something, a cable taut and trembling beneath the surface. A moment of silence. Then a thunderous blast erupted barely 200 meters off the port bow. A plume of seawater shot skyward, raining steel fragments onto the deck. The men hit the floor hands over heads as burning shrapnel clattered against the hull. They had cut one mine loose and survived its fury. Naval Combat Report, May 1940. Hours blurred into each other. Smoke hung low across the water, merging with the fog until sea and sky became one colorless void. The ship's compass spun erratically, disoriented by magnetic interference. "We've lost north," a junior officer stammered. Hargreaves didn't answer. He didn't need the compass. He relied on memory, the feel of the wind, the tilt of the swells, the rhythm of the tides against the hull. His navigation was instinct now, honed by fear and the strange calm that comes when a man accepts he may already be dead. Personal diary fragment recovered, 1946. By late afternoon, they reached the outer edge of the charted zone. Behind them, the sea boiled with distant detonations, the remains of mines severed by their sweep. Ahead, open water beckoned, but the radio crackled with grim news. A second field had been discovered farther east, thicker and deadlier than the first. The Admiralty requested Speedwell to press on. No reinforcements available. The captain turned to Hargreaves. "You know what this means," he said quietly. Hargreaves nodded once. He adjusted the wheel. "Then we keep going." Fleet Order number 1214, 1940. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. The sea froze into glassy ripples under a pale moon. The crew worked in silence. Exhaustion and terror fused into mechanical obedience. Somewhere ahead lay the unknown, a labyrinth of magnetic traps stretching for miles. Hargreaves's face was pale under the lamplight, but his eyes were steady. "We've come this far," he whispered. "The mines can't have us now." Crew testimony, 1947. At 2200 hours, a faint glimmer appeared on the horizon, a light that shouldn't have been there. The captain raised his binoculars. It wasn't a lighthouse. It flickered erratically like a dying flame. Hargreaves leaned forward, frowning. "That's no beacon," he said slowly. "That's a burning ship." The men stared in silence as the glow reflected off the waves, revealing twisted wreckage half submerged in the black water. A chill ran through the crew. Another minesweeper had gone ahead and hadn't made it. Naval Loss Report, 1940. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the hum of the generator and the soft slap of waves against steel. Hargreaves turned the wheel 2 degrees starboard, a tiny correction that might mean life or death. The engines rumbled back to life, propelling them toward the second minefield. Somewhere beneath that quiet, glistening surface, hundreds of silent bombs waited for the slightest spark of metal or magnetism to unleash. Chaos. The Speedwell entered the darkness, and the sea swallowed her whole. Sea before them was a graveyard of secrets. Beneath the waves, hundreds of magnetic and acoustic mines slept in silence, each armed with intricate sensors waiting for a ship's steel signature to stir them awake. But Petty Officer James Hargreaves had something the Germans hadn't counted on, an almost instinctive understanding of how to turn the ocean itself into a map. He had studied currents, magnetic drift, even the pulse of the engines that could betray them to unseen explosives. And as HMS Speedwell crept into the second minefield on May 10, 1940, his gamble would test the limits of science and nerve alike. Royal Navy Mine Warfare Report, 1940. British engineers had only recently begun experimenting with counter-magnetic techniques. One such innovation was the degaussing coil, a copper cable wound around the hull, creating an electromagnetic field to cancel the ship's magnetic signature. It was crude, improvised, and untested in active combat. Installed at Chatham Dockyard only days before departure, it hummed faintly beneath the decks, powered by the same generators that fed the ship's lights. Hargreaves trusted it like a lifeline, but no one aboard truly knew if it would work against the latest German Type G mines laid by Luftwaffe Heinkel bombers. Admiralty Engineering Circular number 47, 1940. The sea hissed against the bow as the ship advanced. Every few yards, sailors deployed magnetic sweeps, long electric cables trailing astern, pulsing with controlled current to simulate a ship's magnetic field and trigger mines prematurely. The idea was elegant, the execution perilous. The faintest miscalibration, and the mine would detonate too close. On the starboard deck, able Seaman Collier crouched by the power control box, eyes fixed on the amateur needle. The hum rose, then steadied. A flash beneath the waves, and then a muffled thump. One mine down, 99 to go. Technical Manual TM 9-294, 1943. Hargreaves plotted their course on a damp chart, pencil scratching over coordinates that seemed to shift with every swell. The captain stood beside him, jaw clenched, watching the compass twitch as magnetic interference rippled through the bridge. "She's pulling 3 degrees north," he muttered. "The field's thick here." Hargreaves recalculated bearings using dead reckoning, the only method that didn't rely on distorted instruments. Outside, the fog was so dense that the bowlight illuminated nothing but a grey wall of vapour. "We're blind," one sailor whispered. "Then listen harder," Hargreaves replied. Captain's log, HMS Speedwell, May 10, 1940. Below decks, the engineer, Chief Petty Officer Arthur Lane, monitored the degaussing coils. Lane was no warrior. He had been a railway electrician before the war, but his modifications to the system kept the ship alive. "She'll sing a different note now," he'd told Hargreaves earlier, tuning the coils like a violin to counteract magnetic detection. That improvisation, born of desperation, would soon be standard issue across the fleet. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. At 07:15 hours, the first test came. A faint metallic click echoed from beneath the hull, a magnetic sensor arming. The crew froze. Seconds later, a dull explosion rippled through the stern wake, harmlessly astern. Lane exhaled, drenched in sweat. "That one should have had us," he said. Hargreaves gave a rare half-smile. "She's working," he murmured. For the first time, hope glimmered through the tension. Naval Combat Report, May 1940, but hope was fleeting. Radio intercepts suggested a U-boat prowled nearby, laying fresh mines during the night. The Speedwell's sonar picked faint echoes, metallic, hollow, moving. "That's no whale," the sonar operator whispered. The U-boat's presence meant disaster. Every sweep cable, every pulse of current was a beacon. Yet retreat was impossible. The convoy of supply ships still waited for a safe corridor. "We keep sweeping," the captain ordered. Coastal Command Log, 1940. The second minefield was worse than the first. It contained a new hybrid, pressure mines triggered by changes in sea depth and hull displacement. The British had no countermeasure. Their only weapon was precision. Hargreaves adjusted ballast manually, bleeding water from the tanks to alter their draft inch by inch. The ship rode higher, lighter, skimming the danger zone like a leaf on glass. "Every ton we lose is one more chance to live," he said. Naval Technical Research Memo, 1941. At 10:20 hours, a lookout shouted, "Mine to port." Through the fog, a dull black sphere drifted up, brushing the surface, one of the rare tethered types. Its horns gleamed wetly in the half-light. The paravane line caught it, slicing the cable, and the mine bobbed free. But instead of drifting away, it began to circle back, drawn by the ship's wake. Panic erupted. The gunners fired a burst from the Oerlikon, shells splashing harmlessly nearby. Hargreaves barked, "Full reverse!" The engines roared. The stern dropped and the mine floated past, 5 yards off, before vanishing under the waves. Seconds later, the sea erupted behind them. Action Report, HMS Speedwell, 1940. When the shockwave subsided, silence returned, broken only by the rattle of loose rivets. The captain looked at Hargreaves. "You steered us through that by instinct?" he asked. Hargreaves nodded, his face pale. "By luck, sir. But I'll take luck." Crew interview, 1947. They pressed on, each minute an eternity. Lane's coils began to overheat, sparks flickering from the junction box. The copper insulation smoked, filling the engine room with acrid fumes. He stripped his gloves and worked barehanded, tightening bolts while the deck trembled beneath him. A small explosion flared astern. Another mine detonated safely. Lane grinned through the smoke. "She still hums," he said hoarsely. That hum would save thousands of lives before the war's end. Royal Navy Engineering Bulletin, 1941. By early afternoon, the sea calmed. The fog began to lift, revealing a patchwork of floating debris, lifeboat planks, oil slicks, fragments of uniforms. The remains of another minesweeper, perhaps HMS Bramble or Hussar. "God help them," a sailor muttered. Hargreaves said nothing, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where faint smoke trails marked the route home. "We'll clear it all," he said. "Every last one." Fleet Debrief, 1940. But the test of the new technology was far from over. As they neared the final segment of the field, enemy aircraft appeared, Heinkel 115 seaplanes, low and silver against the rising sun. The Speedwell's guns opened up, tracers slicing the sky. Bombs splashed wide, detonating harmlessly. But the vibrations they caused could trigger nearby mines. "Steady her," the captain yelled. Hargreaves gritted his teeth, steering through the bomb-blasted surf as mines detonated in chaotic sequence around them. A deadly chain reaction. Luftwaffe Sortie Report 1940. The air filled with salt, smoke, and the acrid tang of cordite. Shrapnel whined across the deck. Hargreaves ducked behind the wheel, guiding the vessel through pillars of spray and flame. "Left 10 degrees?" shouted the captain. "Now!" Hargreaves obeyed, feeling the ship lurch as another explosion lifted the stern clear of the water. For a breathless second, it seemed they would roll over. Then the bow slammed back down, the deck awash in boiling foam. Somehow miraculously the hull held. Damage control log, HMS Speedwell 1940. When the smoke cleared, the Heinkels were gone, driven off by British Hurricanes from a nearby carrier group. The minefield was silent again, its fury spent. The crew stared at the churned sea, where dozens of detonations had marked their path like footprints across a battlefield. The degaussing coil still hummed faintly below. The compass, for the first time in hours, pointed true north. RAF Combat Record, May 1940. As night fell, Hargreaves leaned against the bridge rail, staring into the dark water that had nearly claimed them. The ship was battered, its paint scorched but alive. Below, Lane rested beside his machinery, grease-streaked and exhausted. The captain recorded a final entry in the log. "Minefield cleared. Crew intact. Mission accomplished." Then he looked at Hargreaves and said quietly, "History won't remember this, but we will." Captain's log, May 10, 1940. What none of them yet knew was that their survival, and Lane's improvised engineering, would change naval warfare forever. Degaussing, once an experiment, would become standard across Allied fleets, saving countless ships from destruction. But for Hargreaves, it was just another night survived, another voyage through death's silent fields. And ahead, beyond the smoke and stars, lay the next impossible order. When dawn broke over the English Channel on May 11, 1940, HMS Speedwell lay at anchor in a grey stillness. The sea around her, once a killing field, shimmered with the eerie calm that only follows violence. Oil slicks glistened in the morning light, dotted with fragments of shattered buoys and the twisted remains of exploded mines. Hargreaves stood on deck, watching the sun rise behind the drifting smoke. Around him, the crew moved silently, each man aware that he was alive through a combination of precision, courage, and sheer luck. Royal Navy War Diary, May 1940. The victory was not loud. There were no cheers, no salutes. Just exhaustion, and the heavy understanding that their work had cleared a path for others. Within hours, the first convoy began to move through the corridor they had carved open, carrying ammunition, food and medical supplies toward the desperate British Expeditionary Force retreating through Belgium. Each merchant ship that passed through represented thousands of lives sustained. The Speedwell's ordeal was only a small note in a vast symphony of survival. British Expeditionary Force Logistics Report 1940. But in London, the news sent a ripple through the Admiralty. The degaussing coil, Lane's improvised engineering miracle, had proven itself in the harshest test imaginable. Messages flew across teleprinters. Speedwell system functional. Recommend fleet-wide adoption. Overnight, a crash program began. Teams of dockyard electricians worked around the clock, winding copper cables around the hulls of destroyers, cruisers, and even merchant ships. Engineers from Vickers and Metropolitan Vickers collaborated with the Royal Navy's mine warfare branch, translating one ship's desperate experiment into a standardized system that would protect an empire's lifelines. Admiralty Directive 217B, 1940. By the end of 1940, more than 1,000 vessels were fitted with degaussing gear. The effect was dramatic. Mine losses dropped by nearly half. The Germans responded by improving their mines, developing new acoustic and pressure triggers, but the Allies adapted in kind, layer upon layer of engineering ingenuity, answering every new threat. Hargreaves and Lane's field improvisation had sparked a technological arms race beneath the waves. Bureau of Ordnance Technical Review, 1941. For the men who sailed those ships, the psychological change was profound. Before degaussing, every passage through a mined channel was an act of faith. Crews whispered prayers, counting seconds between heartbeats as the hull groaned beneath their feet. Now, for the first time, they had an invisible shield, something man-made, tangible, measurable. It felt like armor you couldn't see, recalled one sailor years later. You still heard the thumps in the distance, but you believed your ship could cheat death. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The impact stretched far beyond morale. Strategically, it gave the Royal Navy freedom of movement. The mines that had once threatened to starve Britain into submission now became obstacles to overcome, not barriers to fear. Convoy routes grew more ambitious, stretching through the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and into the Arctic supply lines feeding Russia. Each safe crossing reinforced the same truth. The war's outcome hinged not only on bravery, but on the minds of engineers who fought with copper wire instead of guns. Allied Maritime Logistics Report, 1942. For Hargreaves himself, the weeks after the mission blurred into routine. He returned to port only briefly, before being reassigned to train new navigators in minefield operations. His lectures were terse, methodical, and grounded in the lessons of that night. "Trust your compass less and your calculations more," he would say. "Machines fail. Math doesn't." He became known as a quiet instructor, unflinching, meticulous, haunted. His shipmates said he never celebrated their survival, only acknowledged it. Royal Navy Training Division Archives, 1941. Lane, the chief engineer who had retuned the coils with bare hands, was awarded a commendation for technical innovation. But he refused to call himself an inventor. "We were just scared men trying not to explode," he said in a post-war interview. That's what necessity looks like. Yet his design notes, hastily scribbled in pencil and oil stains, became part of the Royal Navy's standard manual for magnetic countermeasures, a manual that would remain in use into the Cold War. Naval Engineering Journal, 1952. Meanwhile, German intelligence struggled to understand how British ships were suddenly surviving their minefields. Abwehr reports suggested possible experimental demagnetization. Abwehr Field Memo, 1940. Luftwaffe crews laying new mines complained that targets seemed to vanish from magnetic detection. A dramatized composite interrogation of a captured Kriegsmarine officer recorded his disbelief. "We laid 200. They passed through untouched. It was as if their ships were made of wood." That frustration reflected a deeper shift, the slow realization that technical supremacy in war was slipping from Germany's grasp. U.S. Naval Intelligence Interrogation Report, 1945. By 1942, the mine war had become an invisible duel. German scientists created mines that combined acoustic sensors with delayed fuses, while Allied engineers countered with acoustic decoys, noisy steel drums towed behind ships, fooling mines into premature detonation. Degaussing evolved into a symphony of electromagnetic defense, calculated to neutralize fields invisible to the human eye. Every success built upon the desperate improvisation aboard Speedwell 2 years earlier. Mine Warfare Development Report, 1942. Psychologically, the event left its mark on all who survived. Crew diaries recovered decades later speak of dreams filled with the sound of that humming coil, the phantom vibration of an unseen weapon beneath their feet. Some never sailed again. Others became instructors, carrying the knowledge forward. "We fought the sea, not the enemy," one survivor wrote. But the sea fought fairer. Crew Diary Collection, Imperial War Museum. For the Admiralty, the moral was clear. War could not be won by courage alone. It demanded intellect, precision, and the unyielding patience to solve problems that killed without warning. Hargreaves' navigation through the minefields became a case study in the Naval Staff College, proof that survival was a calculation as much as a conviction. His quiet defiance inspired younger officers who would go on to fight in the Mediterranean and Pacific, each carrying a sliver of his lesson. That control of the invisible could decide the fate of fleets. Royal Navy Tactical Training Syllabus, 1943. When the war ended, HMS Speedwell was decommissioned and scrapped in 1946. Its name faded into the long roll of forgotten vessels. But one artifact remained, a single section of copper coil preserved in a glass case at Portsmouth. Labeled simply, First Operational Degaussing System, tested under fire. Visitors rarely paused to read the small plaque. Yet for those who knew, it represented the night-human ingenuity outwitted the deadliest trap in naval history. Portsmouth Naval Museum record, 1948. Hargreaves lived out his days in quiet anonymity. He never wrote a memoir, never spoke at reunions. When asked once by a journalist what he remembered most, he said only, "The silence after the last explosion. That's when I knew we'd beaten it. Not the enemy, but the fear." Veteran Oral History Project, 1965. In the decades that followed, his legacy echoed through every ship that sailed with electromagnetic armor. Every naval officer, trained to think like a scientist as well as a soldier. The principles of degaussing would evolve into stealth technology, submarine noise reduction, and magnetic signature management used in modern fleets. The ghosts of those minefields became blueprints for survival in the nuclear age. The Defense Science Review, 1978. The story of one sailor's hopeless voyage became more than a wartime anecdote. It became a parable of resilience, ingenuity, and the invisible war beneath the waves. In the final report filed by the Admiralty, a single line summarized what had happened in those deadly hours. Enemy mines rendered ineffective by adaptation under fire. Admiralty Historical Summary, 1946. And though history seldom remembers Petty Officer James Hargreaves, every time a modern vessel passes safely through hostile waters, a trace of his courage still hums in the quiet rhythm of its coils, an echo of the man who navigated death itself and lived to tell no tale.